Beneath the flickering light of ancient oil lamps, in monasteries carved into African rock and desert sands, words were copied with trembling hands, words that shaped the destiny of faith itself. These were not the polished Bibles bound in leather we recognize today, but fragile manuscripts inked in Ge'ez, Coptic, Syriac, and Aramaic, the languages closest to the breath of Jesus and his earliest followers. Yet when we open them, what we find challenges the image the world has grown so accustomed to, the pale-skinned, golden-haired Christ of European art. The ancient texts tell another story. They whisper of a man rooted in the sun-scorched lands of Africa and Asia, a figure far removed from the Western portraits that later came to dominate. This is not conspiracy, it is history, written in ink centuries before colonial brushstrokes painted a different face. Let us travel back, not to Renaissance cathedrals or medieval Europe, but to the highlands of Ethiopia, where the Garima Gospels have rested for over 1,500 years. These manuscripts, preserved against time in the Garima Monastery, are the world's oldest surviving Christian texts still bound in their original covers. Within their pages lies a vision of Jesus never filtered through the lens of European imagination. He is depicted in the colors of the earth, surrounded by disciples whose features reflect the Semitic and African roots of early Christianity. Scholars date these Gospels to the 5th or 6th century, centuries before Christianity took deep root in Europe. The message is clear. The first Christians saw Christ through their own reality, not through an imported foreign face. But Ethiopia was not alone in holding these memories. Across the deserts of Egypt, the Coptic Church, one of the oldest Christian communities in the world, preserved their own sacred heritage. The Coptic icons of Jesus show a man of darker complexion, eyes deep with Semitic intensity, wearing features consistent with the people of the Nile Valley. The Coptic language, descended from ancient Egyptian, carried prayers that spoke of a savior rooted in their own land, their own struggles. Yet when centuries passed, these voices were drowned out. Why? The answer lies in Rome, power, and empire. In the 4th century, when Constantine embraced Christianity, the faith began its transformation from a persecuted sect of the Middle East into the official religion of an empire. Rome, seeking unity, sought also control. Images of Jesus began to shift, subtly at first, aligning him more with Greco-Roman ideals than his Jewish and Near Eastern identity. By the Middle Ages, European art had recast him entirely. Fair skin, light eyes, flowing hair, a Christ remade in Europe's image. This was not historical truth, it was cultural dominance, the reshaping of sacred identity to mirror the empire's reflection. Yet the older texts never forgot. In the Syriac Peshitta, one of the earliest translations of the Bible into the Aramaic dialect closest to what Jesus himself spoke, descriptions of the people of Galilee reflect their Semitic heritage: olive skin, dark hair, Middle Eastern features. Archaeological findings from Judea, including burials from the time of Jesus, confirm the same. The typical Jewish man of the 1st century stood around 5.5 feet tall, with tan skin from the desert sun, dark hair, and features common to the Middle East. This was the world Jesus was born into, the same world his followers later carried to Africa and Asia and beyond. Still, the story deepens when we consider the silence. Why were these truths overlooked, ignored, or even erased in the centuries that followed? Part of the answer lies in colonial expansion. As European empires carved across Africa and Asia, they carried not just swords and cannons, but Bibles and paintings. A pale-skinned Jesus became a tool of cultural control, a silent assertion of superiority, reinforcing the idea that salvation itself looked European. The darker depictions of Christ, still venerated in African and Eastern churches, were dismissed as primitive or even heretical. And yet they endured. In Lalibela, Ethiopia, carved into stone in the 12th century, 11 rock-hewn churches stand as testimony to a Christianity unbroken, independent, and unapologetically African. The faces of Christ painted on their walls remain untouched by Western brushes, showing a Jesus who belongs to the soil and people of Africa. In Kerala, India, the St. Thomas Christians, whose tradition traces back to the Apostle Thomas himself, preserved their faith through Syriac liturgy and Asian cultural forms, resisting European alteration for centuries. These communities held fast to their image of Christ, one that resonated with their own ancestry, not with the imported ideals of colonial missionaries. And here lies the revelation. The farther we go back, the darker the depictions become. The closer we draw to the sources, the further we drift from the pale face that filled European cathedrals. What emerges instead is a tapestry of Christ rooted in Semitic and African soil, a man of the Middle East whose earliest followers never mistook him for a European. But this history raises an unsettling question. How many of these ancient voices have been lost entirely? We know of texts burned during the Roman persecutions, scrolls hidden in caves like those at Qumran, manuscripts stolen or destroyed in colonial raids. How many depictions of Jesus, authentic, unfiltered, were silenced before they could ever be seen? The Book of Enoch, cherished in Ethiopia but excluded from Western Bibles, offers just one example of how Africa preserved what Europe dismissed. What else remains hidden in forgotten libraries, sealed monasteries, or beneath the sands of deserts yet to be unearthed? The truth, it seems, was never lost. It was rewritten. Today, as scholars, archaeologists, and theologians return to these ancient sources, a new picture is emerging. It is not the familiar face from Renaissance paintings, but one closer to the historical reality. A Jewish teacher from the Middle East, whose skin bore the sun, whose eyes reflected his Semitic heritage, and whose story took root in African and Asian lands long before Europe ever painted him white. And so we are left with a question that echoes like a whisper through time. What other truths remain buried, reshaped by power, erased by conquest? How many portraits of the past are still waiting to be revealed? This is history off the map. If you want to keep uncovering the stories hidden by time, the erased faces, the forbidden books, the histories they told us to forget, subscribe, share, and join us on the journey. Because history is never just what survives, it is also what was taken away.